Why should we fast if the disciples of Jesus themselves were not fasting? This is the question that people asked Jesus in Mark 2:18. Let's look into that. Mark 2:18. Let's read. Kai isan hoi mathetai io anu, kai hoi pharisai nesteuantes. Kai erkontai kai legus in auto. Diati hoi mathetai io anu, kai hoi mathetai ton pharisaion nesteuasin. Hoi de soi mathetai unesteuasin. Mark 2:18 is kind of a long verse. Generally, Mark verses are kind of short. This one is kind of long. And so we're going to break it down in two sentences. So the first sentence is going to be right here, which ends where this period is. Of course, we know that in the original Greek, there's no punctuation. That was added later to make it more readable. And then you have this second sentence here that starts with this other kai. So the two sentences starts with these two kai. And the second sentence is much longer because it contains in itself the question of the Pharisees. And the question starts here where you see this comma and ends here where you see this semicolon that, as we've seen before, in Greek represents a question mark. So this whole thing is the question of the Pharisees. So let's focus first on the first sentence. So the very first line. The very first line is introduced by the usual kai and this conjunction that is used all the time by Mark to introduce the next concept. And then you have the subject of the sentence, which is made up of these hoi, mathetai, kai, hoi, pharisaioi. So it's two sets of people. Hoi mathetai yo ano. So this is a genitive and specify what kind of disciples they are, whose disciples they are. So this is a genitive. Okay. So this is subject number one, connected, and subject number two. Okay. So it's a combination of two sets or two categories of people, and the rest is just the verb. So the principal verb is asen, verb one, which is connected to the present participle, is the participle um, that make up the verb structure. Of course, together with the two subjects. So this participle is in the masculine plural form because, of course, it refers to the subject, which are masculine plural. All right. The translation of this is going to be very easy. So, mathetai are the disciples. Okay, those are the disciples. The term mathetai comes from the verb manthano, which means to learn. So hoi mathetai are the students, right? We need to remember that Jesus was perceived at the time as a typical Jewish rabbi that had his own students. So what we today call disciples were at the time really students of rabbis. So hoi is the right, the definite article, masculine plural. So the disciples, yo ano, you see this ending u, which indicates a genitive singular. So, and the name is a proper name. Ioannis is Ioannes John, right? So of John. Now, what John is this? This is John the Baptist. So it's referring to John the Baptist. So these are the disciples of John the Baptist. Kai and hoi Pharisaioi, again, the Pharisees. So pretty easy. So these are the Pharisees, which were, the high class, high religious class, governing class that had the religious power at that time. So the two sets of subjects here are the disciples of John the Baptist and the Pharisees. And what were they doing? Well, Azen is the verb to be in the imperfect tense. Okay. Now, the imperfect tense indicates an action that is a continuous action. Okay. So Mark wants to give us the idea that the disciples of John and the Pharisees were continuously, regularly doing something. And what they were doing is they were, isn't what? Nesteuantes. Now, the verb nesteo um, is the verb used to indicate the idea of fasting, to fast. So it's the practice of abstaining from eating for religious reasons. So, and the disciples of John and the Pharisees were fasting. Doesn't mean necessarily in that very moment. The idea is that they used to fast. They would fast regularly. That's what Mark is talking about. Okay. So what's wrong with this? Well, this is what happens. People notice this. Notice that the disciples of John used to fast. Notice also that the Pharisees used to fast. And so they come and ask Jesus something because they notice something different. Kai, and again, now there's no subject here, but we can imagine that these were just people, right? They were noticing this difference between the disciples of Jesus and not only the Pharisees but also the disciples of John. And so they, general they, okay, they, erkontai. Now erkontai is the present tense, indicative present of the verb erchomai. Now the verb erchomai is a generic term that means to go or to come, according to the context. In this case, the context indicates that the meaning is to come, so it's people coming to Jesus. So, and they come, kai, and legusin, again, present, indicative in the third person plural. We saw the verb lego many, many times. It just means to say, and they say, right? So, and they come and say auto. So, auto is in the dative case, and it's a personal pronoun in the third person singular, right? So to him, they say to him, they tell him, okay? In particular, what they say is a question, so they ask him. They come and they ask him. Okay, let's analyze the structure of the question that starts here and, as we said, ends at the end of the verb of the verse. So you have this diati, um, which is a way of introducing the question. So dia is a preposition that we could translate for, okay, with for, and t is the interrogative pronoun in the neuter case. So it's the English corresponding to what. Okay, so for what, or why, simply why. So it's the Greek way of saying why, diati, for what reason. Okay, for what reason, why. And then you have again a total repetition of what we saw in the first sentence. Hoi mathetai Ioannu. So we're not going to repeat this. These are the disciples of John. Kai hoi mathetai ton Pharisaion, and the disciples of the Pharisees. So nothing new here. Exactly, almost a copy of the first sentence in this verse. So for what reason the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees nestewusin, so this is exactly the same verb here. Now the only difference is that nestewontes is in the participle form. Here, nestewusin is in the indicative present, okay, in the third person plural, but the meaning is the same. Why do they fast? Why do the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees fast? Okay, and you see the ending, the ending of the question has this de in there. Now, this particle is used all the time in Greek, and sometimes it's just thrown in there to give some flavor that indicates the passage from one concept to the next. Some other time it has a much stronger meaning and the meaning is aversive, meaning the author wants to introduce a concept that somehow clashes with the concept mentioned just before. Okay, so it's a sort of though, however, or but. Okay, and in this particular case, it's pretty clear that this day has that meaning, right? There is the contrast between the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees that have this practice of fasting, but however, hoi soi mathetai. So hoi mathetai, again, the disciple soi. What is this soi? Well, soi is a personal pronoun. Again, is a personal pronoun, but this time in the second person singular. Okay. Uh, and what it means is just of you. So literally means the disciples of you. So your disciples. Okay. But your disciples, ooh, this is a negative particle. They don't. Nesteuosin, again, exactly the same thing. So total parallelism, but your disciples don't fast. Okay. So this is the big question. Let's put everything together. Mark 2:18. And the disciples of John and the Pharisees used to fast. And they come and tell him, for what reason the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees fast while your disciples don't? Now, this is a fair question, isn't it? Well, and to find the answer, we will have to wait until Mark 2:19. See you next time.